Chapter 14. A Jump in Trust. Wilbur takes in a shuddering breath as the two people stare with wide eyes at them, at Phil. And there's a burning fire in his chest that grows when Wilbur realizes where their eyes are pointed at. They stare at Phil's wings, feathers pressed against the dirt underneath Phil as he sleeps. And Wilbur bares his teeth, tries his best to make a snarl that will scare them off. He will not let them take a single feather. He will tear out their throats before he lets that happen. Techno's gotten over his shock, and he holds up the sword with a clear threat, taking a careful step back, staying in front of Wilbur and Phil. "Get away," Techno warns, and his voice shakes as he says it. The strangers just stare, speechless in the sight before them. And Techno risks a single glance behind him, looking at Wilbur. Wilbur looks back, eyes wide and fearful. "Oh my goodness," Bad breathes out, and he seems to catch himself, taking a step forward. "Oh my, the both of you, get away!" Techno yells. "Are you okay?" Bad stops, but he doesn't move back. Instead, he kneels down on one knee, holding a hand behind him to keep Skeppy from wandering ahead of him. Skeppy reaches out, holds onto his wrist loosely. "Are you... Oh, you're both so young." "If you get any closer," Techno responds, holding the sword in his hands so tightly that his knuckles nearly turn white. "I'll kill you. I will." No, we're not." Bad glances back at Skeppy, who looks back with a baffled face, completely at a loss of what to do here. "We're not going to hurt you." "Leave," Wilbur whispers, makes a face as his throat burns, almost matching the flame that's in his chest. Bad lets out a quiet breath, his gaze flickering over to Phil again, Wilbur mostly covering him from view with how much he's leaning over him. He can't see his face, but he can see the wings. See a hand resting in the dirt, completely covered in blood, as if he used his nails to tear through someone. Thinking on how there had been people trespassing into the forest, and the state of these kids in front of him, it's not unlikely that Phil had indeed used his nails to kill. "Bad," Skeppy whispers, leaning down close behind Bad's ear. "What the hell do we do? That man has wings. I know. He's an avian. I know." Bad whispers back, turning his head to Skeppy and covering his mouth with a hand, keeping his eyes on the two kids before him. Techno hardly falters in his stance, and Wilbur looks near tears. "Don't make any sudden movements. They're scared." "Leave!" Wilbur tries to scream, but he's used his voice up, and he coughs and leans over Phil, curling up in pain as his throat feels as if it's being stabbed from the inside. "Wilbur?" Techno gasps at seeing Will suddenly lower his head and sound as if he's choking. And he goes to kneel beside Phil, hand reaching out towards Wilbur. "Stop talking. Stop it." "Are you all right?" Bad asks, and Techno sends a glare that promises death if he tries to ask another question. Bad closes his mouth with a sorry expression. "Will?" Techno asks, when Wilbur raises his head again, a single tear falling down his cheek. "Are you okay? Can you talk?" Wilbur shakes his head for both questions. His throat is sore, terribly so. And what he would usually do now is bide his time and not use his voice at all for a little while. But that's not an option. Not with the strangers so close to Phil. "Okay, just..." Techno gives a quick glance to Bad and Skeppy. "Just don't talk." Technoblade stands back up. Wilbur leaning his head down against Phil's chest, pressing a hand into Phil's side and feeling waves of worry wash over him when his hand comes away wet with blood. "You two, go away," Techno threatens, holding his sword up. He ignores how he feels tired, how his hand is shaking, and how his heart races fast in his chest. "Now." Skeppy frowns, Bad shaking his head the smallest bit. The sword in Techno's hand is far from clean, smears of red all across the blade. And Bad doesn't want to know if that means the kid had actually killed or not. It should be obvious, but he hopes that maybe the sword belongs to the man with wings, rather than the boy in front of him that's trying his hardest to be scary. "I can't do that," Bad breathes out. "Leave us alone!" Technoblade screams. "Kid, we can't just leave you here." Skeppy speaks up, holding a hand out. "Yes, you can," Techno says back, narrowing his eyes. "We don't want you here. I want you to leave." "What about your friend?" Bad asks, nodding to Phil, who stays still with his eyes closed. Wilbur can feel him breathe with each passing second, but it's too slow for his comfort. And he closes his eyes to try and stop the way a sob wants to break out. He might need help. He looks like he's hurt. "We don't..." Techno falters at the mention of Phil, and he hesitates, Wilbur humming quietly over Phil's chest. We can't..." "Hey, look, we'll make a deal. You let us help you, and we'll take you to our home nearby. We can patch you guys up," Skeppy offers. And Techno keeps looking at Phil, keeps glancing back, looking as if he's terribly conflicted, torn between choices. Techno stares at them for a long while, the sword in his hands shaking the slightest bit as he blinks rapidly, holding back his own tears. He looks towards Wilbur again. He's rubbed his face clear of any tears, and instead has decided to hold his ear to Phil's chest, listening to the heartbeat. Phil's hurt. Techno knows that much. Even with the necklace, he's still not sure if that's going to be enough. Phil said he would be okay, but it's hard to believe it when he's staying so still on the ground. For a split second, Techno wonders if that's what Phil would look like if he was dead. And there's a sharp pang of fear that stabs his chest. What if Phil dies here? What if that necklace wasn't enough? Magic or not, what if Phil... "I swear we won't do anything to harm you," Bad promises, taking a careful step forward, Techno breathing faster, and turning his attention back and forth to the strangers in front of him, and to his family behind him. "I'm not fond of people hurting others. I won't let you get hurt. I promise." Techno shakes his head, biting his tongue in his mouth, and trying to think, trying to make a plan. But there's no plan. There's no time. There's no opportunity he can take because Phil is unconscious on the ground. Wilbur's voice is gone for the time being, and Technoblade is so tired and scared. He's scared of the people in front of him. He's scared that they're going to be attacking him, just like the people a few minutes ago did. He's scared he's going to have to use this sword again and dig it into someone's chest. He's scared of getting taken away, getting separated from Phil or Wilbur. But he's more scared of letting Phil continue to die. So he lowers his sword, tears brimming at the edge of his eyes. "Please help him." He nods to Phil. "We're okay. He's not. Please." Wilbur looks up, Techno locking eyes with him for a moment, and they silently communicate that this is necessary for Phil's sake. Bad lets out a small sigh of relief, and Skeppy nudges him to move. When Bad stands up to his feet, Techno stumbles back, Wilbur pressing closer to Phil with panic in his eyes. And Bad holds out his hands. "It's all right," he reassures, and Wilbur nods as a response. "I think you're going to need to carry him," Skeppy murmurs, looking at Phil with a small frown. He doesn't look like he's waking up anytime soon. "Is it all right if I pick him up?" Bad asks, pointing a finger towards Phil. "Your friend looks like he's really hurt. I don't know if he should wake up." Techno hesitates, looking towards Wilbur. They're both quiet for a long moment, debating the option in their heads, until Wilbur slides away from Phil, getting to his feet and stepping over Phil to get to Techno. Bad walks forward, quickly making his way over to Phil and leaning down, scanning what injuries he can see. Phil stays perfectly still, breathing slowly and quietly, the necklace sitting over his chest glowing bright red. Bad makes a slight face at the necklace, but pushes it aside and reaches down anyway, picking up Phil from the ground. Wilbur's taken hold of Techno's hand, and he squeezes it tight, not liking the sight of Phil being carried by a stranger they don't know if they can trust. But this is their best bet at the moment, and Wilbur hopes that luck is on their side. "Are you two up for walking a bit?" Bad asks. "Skeppy can carry one of you if you're hurt." Skeppy makes a face like he did not agree to that, but with one stern look from Bad, he nods. Techno glances to Wilbur. Will shakes his head. "No, we can walk. Let's go." Techno says for them, and Bad nods. "Okay, come on. Our home is just a bit more up the hill." He turns and walks into the trees with Phil in his arms, Techno and Wilbur quickly walking after him. Skeppy keeps close behind the two of them. Their house is small and cozy, Wilbur thinks. It's made of stone, the door creaking as it's pushed open, and the inside smells sweetly of cinnamon. The floorboards are a bit cold under his feet, and Wilbur looks down to remember that neither he nor Techno had been able to get shoes on before the chaos of escaping the town happened. He's a bit sad over losing something Phil's given him, but also a bit satisfied at being barefoot once more. He thinks it's more comfy without anything on his feet, even if it means he could step on something pointy outside. Techno keeps a tight grip on his hand as they follow right behind Bad through the hallway, and Wilbur holds on just as tightly back. Even with the unfamiliar house, and the unfamiliar monsters beside them, he feels better at knowing Techno is right next to him. Techno seems to feel the same. He can see Phil's head just barely from around Bad's arm, and Wilbur swallows, feeling his throat burn, and the fire in his chest burn a little more. He's afraid of even having Phil be carried away by someone he can't trust. But Phil needs rest, needs to be patched up, and once they have that, then they can make a plan to take Phil and run. They're led into a room, and Techno and Wilbur stand to the side awkwardly, looking around and finding it to be a simple room with a bed, a few bookshelves, and a desk in the corner. There's a lantern that sits at the nightstand, and it glows bright blue as Phil is placed down onto the bed, still asleep. "Skeppy, could you go get some bandages and potions?" Bad asks, standing at the bedside, head turned to his partner, lingering by the doorway. "Sure," Skeppy agrees, and he walks off down the hall. Bad turns his head back to Phil, looking at the wings for just a moment, before moving on and scanning for anything that's life-threatening. The wound on his side seems to be the worst, but there's a few wounds on his arms and chest, too. And he's not sure if Phil's hurt on his hands or not, because there's drying blood smeared all across his fingers and palms. Techno and Wilbur step quietly to the side of the room, watching intently at Bad and his hands, as, If he does anything to Phil, they'll be returning it tenfold. Bad smiles, raising his head to the two of them. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself earlier. You can call me Bad. The one who's all shiny is Skeppy. Techno doesn't give a response, but Wilbur nods the slightest bit. What's your name? Bad asks, and he just gets narrowed eyes in response. Or your friend's name? He points to Phil. He's our dad. Techno mutters, and Bad nods. Oh, okay. They don't say anything more. Well, your dad is going to be just fine, okay? He better be. Techno says back, and Wilbur smirks the tiniest bit, looking nearly smug. Skeppy comes back with a box of healing supplies, and Bad goes to try and patch up Phil, ignoring the way blood is staining the sheets, and the way there are two sets of eyes watching his every move. Chapter 15. Recover just a bit. Bad won't lie. He's a bit nervous. Not so nervous to where it's hard to focus on what he's doing, because he can't afford to be negligent with tending to someone's wounds, especially with someone like this. But he is a bit put off by how the kids are just staring. Glaring, more like. Bad presses a towel to Phil's side to try and stop the bleeding a bit, and when it comes away with red, he feels as if two holes are being burnt into the back of his head. Well, he's glad they seem to care for their dad. Risking a glance behind him, he's met with the sight of Techno still glaring daggers, red eyes narrowed in a way that promises consequences if Phil is not treated. Wilbur is holding onto his arm, clinging in a way that's heartwarming, but he's also giving a death glare at Bad, and the clawed hands that hover over Phil's wounds. They're so young. Bad is old, he knows that. He's sorta lost count, but he's around 500 years old last he checked. He's probably a bit more by now. Maybe his idea of young could be a bit skewed, but he knows that these two are kids. Children who had ran into the forest with their father for safety. There's blood splattered over Wilbur's shirt. Not his own blood, but a result of fighting, no doubt. Technoblade has blood on his face, his hands, and it makes Bad feel a bit sad. Children shouldn't need to fight. Shouldn't need to defend their lives due to cruel people. Usually the townspeople don't go to this extent, don't go so far as to actually try and hurt children. He's glad they're here in his home now. And he's glad that them and their dad had gotten to the forest. Now they're under his watch. And now that means they're safe. Even if they're not so convinced of the fact. The necklace over Phil's chest glows red, and Bad's eyes are drawn to it, and his ears can pick up on a quiet hum. It's enchanted, no doubt, with something strong that Bad has never seen before. The color of it reminds him of the healing potions Skeppy gave him just a minute prior, and a suspicion rises up in his head. He checks the wound in Phil's side, and finds it smaller than before. It's cleaner, thanks to Bad and his efforts, but he hasn't even used any potions yet. It's healing unusually quick, and Bad isn't sure if that's because of the necklace and its enchantment, or because the man is an avian. Perhaps avians have the ability to heal quickly without any potions? He wouldn't know. The only information Bad has of avians is lost. Old books that have mostly withered away to time. Skeppy clears his throat, pulling Bad out of his mind, and he looks behind him to see Skeppy lingering awkwardly at the doorway, one of the boys turning his head to him, and the other still paying close attention to Bad. Are you guys hungry or something? Skeppy asks, pointing a thumb behind him, expression unsure. There's food and water in the kitchen. Both Bad and Skeppy aren't strangers to having guests. There's always extra dinner, an extra bed. But it's been a bit of a while since someone has come here for safety. And it's been even longer since anyone so young has come here, either. Oh, yes! Bad stands up straight, waving a hand to the door. You two can go rest and maybe eat something while I do this, okay? Maybe change into some new clothes, if you want. I don't know if anything would fit you two, but maybe a shirt of mine? Skeppy holds two hands up, seeming to try and see how big his own shirt is, and then comparing it to Wilbur, who blinks at him with a raised eyebrow. Maybe. It'd be kind of big. Wilbur frowns, but Technoblade glances towards the doorway and seems to consider it for a moment, tugging at the arm that Wilbur is clinging to. Will looks towards him, and Techno nods his head to Skeppy. Wilbur shakes his head. Techno raises his eyebrows. Wilbur makes a vague hand gesture. Bad blinks, checking on Phil once again, and he's glad to find the avian still breathing steadily, the wound in his side seeming to grow smaller by the second, and the necklace laying on his chest still glowing brightly. Wilbur and Techno continue to communicate silently, and Techno gestures towards his throat, then his mouth, and then pokes a finger into Wilbur's chest. Wilbur blinks, and they both stare at each other for a solid 3 seconds, then turn to Skeppy. Do you have tea? Technoblade asks. Skeppy stumbling at the fact they've spoken up out of the blue, while they had seemed to be in the middle of an intense, silent conversation. Maybe? Skeppy shrugs, glancing at Bad. Check the top cabinets. Bad waves a hand, reaching for bandages. Probably. Skeppy changes his answer. Techno gives a look at Wilbur, as if he's asking a question, and Wilbur looks towards Phil, frowns, then nods. Okay, Techno says. And he and Wilbur walk towards the doorway, Skeppy moving to the side to let them pass, and watching as they wait with stares for him to lead them to the kitchen. Guess we're gonna make tea then, Skeppy mutters, leading the way. I'll be sure to call you if your dad wakes up, Bad yells out, and he doesn't get a response, only the sound of footsteps quietly padding down the hall. Bad sighs, eyes falling to the necklace again. His eyes wander to the wings on Phil's back, and he can't explain the emotion that comes with seeing it. Sorrow, maybe. Surprise, shock, joy. What can anyone feel upon seeing a person that shouldn't be alive? From what Bad knows, avians were killed a long time ago. The reasons seem to vary, though, and the history is warped. Any books that talk about avians come from when they were still alive, and those books have practically fallen apart to old age. Bad's found a few, but it's not enough to really tell what happened. When he asked around, people either didn't know that avians existed, or just thought it was an old tale. People with wings had fallen away from memory, and Bad couldn't find anything. The idea of it was depressing. An entire people gone. Bad knows they exist, knows they had to, for the books he'd read, and the few stories he'd gotten that had been passed down from generation to generation are proof of that. The man in front of him is living proof of that. All the avians were killed centuries ago, and they were thought to be dangerous as well. Any books that Bad has only tell of how they lived, and any stories he'd gotten from people just tell him that they had used to be a dangerous type of people, stronger than most, more magical than most. Bad had assumed that maybe they had been considered a threat, and that was that. A drastic decision, and a bit of a flimsy reason for all of them to be snuffed out. But that was all he had. He didn't really have better answers. He didn't have any type of answers. Only his own questions and searches that led to nowhere. But this man could have some answers. If he's alive, then surely there are others. If he's here, then maybe they hadn't all been killed, but rather went into hiding. Bad hopes that's what happened. It's a better reality than all the avians being gone. He had always wanted to meet one. Maybe not like this, but it's better than nothing. He stopped searching about avians a long time ago, when he settled down with Skeppy to live here. Maybe he should have kept on searching. Phil doesn't stir as Bad carefully ties the bandages tightly around his middle, keeping the wound secure. It'll probably heal rather quickly, judging by the magic the man clearly possesses. He carefully pulls away Phil's shirt, frowns at how soaked with blood it is, and how torn it looks, and he puts it to the side. There's a sword that's attached to his hip, and Bad, very slowly, takes it away, placing it to the side as well. No need for that. Bad wonders if there's something he's missing. It's been a long while since he and Skeppy have left the forest. The villagers aren't usually so persistent as to chase monsters past the tree line, because they know Bad offers sanctuary. They're well aware that he lives here, and that anyone who comes into the forest is under his watch and not to be hurt. But they had run in anyway, sword and crossbows raised, and there had been an awful lot of them. Bad had gotten a peek at the outside of the forest, and found a rather big crowd hovering nearby. This man and his children had stirred up quite a commotion, and Bad isn't sure if it's because he's an avian, or if it's because his children were hybrids. Not that the townspeople would know the importance and rarity of him being an avian, though. Most people don't remember avians. Bad resists the urge to try and wake up the man, to ask questions. He wants to know what happened. He wants to know why he's alive. By all accounts, this shouldn't be possible. But then again, Bad knows that destiny can work a bit funny at times. Bad raises up Phil's hand and frowns at the way it's soaked with blood. It looks like he used his bare hands to kill someone, and he doesn't doubt for a moment that that was the case. Even so, Bad doesn't feel threatened by the man in front of him, and he instead takes a towel and tries to scrub off the red on Phil's hands. Why does a man like this have two kids that are drastically different hybrids? It's not terribly unusual, but most families aren't so diverse. They're wary as well, evident with how the boys haven't even given up their names. And instead of crying and being scared, they had only stayed quiet and on guard. It's not quite right in Bad's head. At that age, he would expect them to be scared, to be crying and wanting comfort. But the only comfort they take is by holding on to each other. And they had seemed more focused on the possible threat around them, almost like they're too used to situations like this. Bad doesn't like the idea of that. Kids so young shouldn't have to worry. They should be living a peaceful life. Maybe once their dad wakes up, and Bad knows more, he could point them towards somewhere safe. He's sure he knows a few places that are good to hide out, to live. Perhaps then their situation could be better. He uses water on the towel, scrubs a bit more, and tries to not think too hard on the questions that are swirling around in his head, or the concerns that press against his heart. Instead, he just sits on the bed beside the sleeping avian and tries to wash away the blood that stains Phil's hands. The kids are kind of creepy, in Skeppy's opinion. They barely seem to pay attention to Skeppy at all, talking in very quiet whispers in each other's ears. When Skeppy tries to ask them a question, they'll give him a face rather than answer, as if he's being weird. The kitchen, thankfully, is clean, thanks to Bad's habits of keeping up with the chores. It's a bit dim, since it's night, but the lanterns they have scattered around give a homey feeling to the room. That, With the potted plants put around, and the faint smell of soup that had been for dinner earlier, it's an inviting scene. He offers seats at the table, and watches as the two boys walk over to the chairs and sit down, the wooden legs screeching against the kitchen floor. Wilbur rests his elbows onto the table, looking around at the environment with a curious face. Techno seems curious as well, but he's mostly focused on Skeppy, watching him with a bored expression that feels nearly judgmental. Skeppy hopes that's just his resting face, and he's not currently getting judged by a kid. Not that he would care. Surely a kid's opinion of him isn't that important. Techno nudges Wilbur in the arm, and Wilbur reaches out to him, the two of them holding hands underneath the table as they lean in to whisper quietly to each other. Skeppy can barely hear their voices, let alone words. "Could you make him some tea?" Technoblade asks, raising his head to Skeppy, who jolts and quickly stops standing in place. "Oh, yeah, sure." Skeppy walks across the kitchen, going towards the cabinets. "Tea. All right." Bad had said the top cabinets, but Skeppy hates the top cabinets, because those are too tall for him to reach, and he has to climb the counter to get them. But it's not like he can tell the guests that he can't make tea because he's short, so he sucks it up and scales the counter. Wilbur watches Skeppy climb up with a bit of amusement, lips twitching up into a smile as the man nearly falls backwards as he opens the cabinet door to see what is on the shelves. Wilbur's a bit glad he's clearly some type of monster. The gems scattered on his face are proof that he's not like the villagers, and the other person had clearly not been human just at a glance. Technoblade had suggested the tea, if only because it could get Wilbur's voice to heal up a bit faster. And then, if anything went south, they had a plan to fall back on. Right now, it seemed like Phil was in good hands, and there isn't any clear threat to be seen. So Wilbur will take the chance to try and get his throat to be less sore. It still stings, painful, and only letting him whisper very quietly. But he doesn't need to shout anything just yet. The only words he's whispering are to Techno's ears only, so they can chat about Phil, about this place, about the man who looks like he has diamonds glued to his skin, who's currently sitting on top of the counter. "I still have my sword, and he's not that big. Do you think if I just jumped at him, I could take him?" Techno says quietly, holding a hand over his mouth as he leans towards Wilbur. Wilbur huffs, smiling. "What if your sword doesn't pierce through the rocks on his skin?" he says back, his voice a bit strained, even though he's speaking so quietly. "I could use another rock and just hit those rocks. Beat him with rocks." The two of them snicker to themselves, Skeppy raising an eyebrow at them, and not knowing that they're discussing ways on how to possibly kill him. It's probably better that he's not aware of it, to be honest. Skeppy grabs a box that seems to contain tea packets, and he hops off the counter and pushes the cabinet door shut. Then goes to turn on the stove for heating some water. "Would you two be willing to change into some clean shirts while this is heating up?" Skeppy asks, hesitantly, getting only blank looks in response. I'll be right back." He quickly goes to run down the hall. Wilbur watches him go, and as Skeppy goes down the hall, his mind wanders to Phil, who's sleeping in a room with a stranger they're not sure they can trust. Wilbur's heart clenches in fear at being reminded of their situation, but it settles with Techno squeezing his hand. Strangers or not, Phil needs rest. Bandages, all of it. Wilbur doesn't want to lose him because they are too stubborn to take people's help. That would be one of the worst ways to lose him, for it would be their faults then. Leaning in towards Technoblade, Wilbur squeezes his hand in return and talks softly. "Do you think Phil is going to be okay?" Technoblade takes a few seconds to respond, face scrunching up in worry. I don't know. He says his necklace was magic, right? Then he's gonna be fine. Yeah. Wilbur nods, thinking of Phil's necklace again. Phil had assured him he was going to be okay, and he'd hate for Phil to have been lying to him. He has to be okay. Needs to be okay. Wilbur doesn't know what he would do if Phil died today, and he doesn't know if he can survive losing something that's become so precious in such a short time. Tears well up at the corner of his eyes, and he sniffles, Techno tugging at his hand. He wants Phil to be okay. He hopes Phil will be okay. It'll be fine, Technoblade whispers. And he doesn't sound completely convinced himself, but it's good to hear his voice either way. Wilbur wipes the back of his hand at his eyes and sighs. Skeppy returns with 2 shirts, and he throws them at the table, both Techno and Wilbur leaning back as the fabric hits the wood with a quiet thump. Okay, those probably won't fit, but it's better than having you guys wear clothes that are, bloody. Skeppy claps his hands together, then reaches behind him for a towel, looking at the sink. You guys should probably wash off, and you can change in a room down the hall, maybe get out. Technoblade says easily, climbing off his chair as Wilbur pulls the shirts towards him, holding it up with a slight frown. Skeppy freezes, then seems to reboot as Techno tugs the towel out of his hands, walking back over to the table to grab a chair and drag it across the floor towards the sink. Wilbur hums, seeming satisfied with their shirts he's been given, and he looks at Skeppy with an expectant expression, waving a hand. Skeppy blinks slowly back at him, and he hears the sink turn on, Techno having climbed onto the chair to reach over the counter more easily. All right then, Skeppy says, seeming to just accept it, and walking off towards the hallway. Yell for me when you're done. He waves a hand, and Techno gives a grunt in response. Will, hey, come over here, Techno says, putting the towel under running water, and watching as Wilbur climbs off his chair to join Techno's side. Techno squeezes as much water as he can out of the towel, then leaves the water running, leaning down from where he's kneeling on the chair and raising the towel up to Wilbur's face. Wilbur makes a scrunched-up expression at Techno, dragging a damp towel across his cheek. And he makes a questioning look towards him, grabbing onto his wrist. You have dirt on your nose, Techno says. And Wilbur scoffs, the heavy feeling in his chest lifting a little. You have blood on your nose, he whispers, pushing the towel at Techno, and it's less of a way to try and clean it off, and more of a smack of damp cloth against Techno's face. Technoblade scrubs at his face, then looks up with a frown, only for Wilbur to pull the towel out of his hands and scrub at his face once more. To be fair, he scrubs a bit more than necessary, but it's funny to see Techno's unimpressed expression when he takes the towel away, his face cleaner. Wilbur uses the towel to clean off his hands, then gives it to Techno, who runs the towel under the water again, and washes his hands as Wilbur goes to change shirts. They're simple shirts, one in a light beige color, and the other is just white. Wilbur takes the beige one and swaps it for his own, frowning at how the yellow of his sweater has been ruined with blood. It's not his own, he's glad of that, but it's still ruined either way. He throws the shirt at Techno's face to get him to swap for cleaner clothes too. And Techno barely catches it with a startled noise, narrowing his eyes towards Wilbur, who pays him no mind, since he's busy pulling a shirt over his head. 2 minutes later, they're cleaner than before, and they have new shirts on that aren't theirs. Wilbur doesn't really like the way they feel, and Techno seems unhappy with the texture too. But, he supposes, it's better than having something stained. Technoblade looks down the hall, Wilbur sitting back on his chair as Techno stands by the table. Will is about to quietly ask if they should call for Skeppy, since the water for the tea should be heated now. But Techno beats him to it, calling down the hall. "Is the pot supposed to be on fire?" Techno asks, and there's footsteps coming down the hall. Skeppy speeding into the kitchen with a panic. Once he sees the pot perfectly fine, with boiling water inside, he gives a grumpy face at Technoblade, who shrugs and seems unbothered. Techno goes to sit back down beside Wilbur, and Skeppy goes to make the tea. It's comfortably silent for a bit, with only the sound of cups clinking when Skeppy goes to grab one. Techno holds Wilbur's hand under the table, and the smell of something citrus-like spreads through the kitchen. Skeppy is about to pour a cup, place it down in front of Wilbur with it still steaming, but Will doesn't get to take a single sip. "Skeppy!" Bad yells, a crash sounding out from down the hallway, and Skeppy looks up in surprise, running with a panic. "Where are my children?" Phil's voice rings out, angry with a clear threat. Technoblade and Wilbur scramble to follow, eyes wide and hearts racing at something having gone wrong. And when they get to the room, they find Phil on the ground with Bad, a knife in his hand that's pointed dangerously close to Bad's face. "What the hell? Get off him!" Skeppy yells, rushing forward. Phil looks up and dodges back from Skeppy trying to kick him off, Bad holding out a hand towards Skeppy as he scoots back. No, wait, it's fine! You motherfucker! Skeppy! Phil leans back on one knee, holding his knife up with a scowl and his wings raising out behind him, the ends of his feathers brushing against the floor. His eyes fall onto the doorway, where Technoblade and Wilbur stare with wide eyes, and his face goes from hostile to drowning in relief within seconds. "Dad!" Techno yells, Wilbur sprinting just a second before he does, the two of them going past where Skeppy is kneeling down beside Bad. They both run into Phil's outstretched arms, and Phil pulls them close with a sigh, his wings wrapping around them both. "Oh, you're okay. You're okay." Phil breathes out, taking in a deep breath, leaning his chin on top of their heads. "You're both all right," he says in clear relief, burying his face into their hair. Bad sits back, feeling Skeppy rest a hand on his shoulder, and they both watch as Phil drops his knife gently onto the ground, solely focused on holding Wilbur and Techno to his chest. "Did he seriously pull a knife on you?" Skeppy asks quietly, Bad smiling hesitantly. "I didn't know he had one on him, and he just kinda woke up and jumped at me. Fucker." Skeppy swears, and Bad smacks him across the back of his head. "Language." Phil opens his eyes then, looking up at the two of them, and he narrows his eyes, twisting away from the two of them and pulling Techno and Wilbur away, his wings staying as a shield. Technoblade and Wilbur stay clinging onto him, and Phil's glare softens when he realizes Wilbur is crying. "Who are you?" Phil asks, serious. The knife he had is placed on the floor, but it wouldn't be hard for him to simply grab it. Bad sighs quietly, with an awkward grin. Chapter 16. Even with everything, he still chose to be kind. "Who are you?" Skeppy snaps back, clearly angry at Bad getting threatened with a knife from a stranger they know absolutely nothing about. "You know, it's a bit rude to be immediately trying to attack the people who rescued you." Bad holds a hand up, trying to calm his partner down. No, Skeppy. It's fine, I'll ask again," Phil says quietly, and they both turn their heads to him. Phil presses Technoblade and Wilbur close to his chest, his wings curling in to keep them out of sight. He picks up the dagger he had put on the ground and keeps it held in his palm, the blade pointing towards them both. "Where am I? What's going on? And who are you?" Wilbur cries quietly into Phil's arms, Phil's face flickering between worried and stoic. Phil tries to scoot back just a bit, keeping distance from people he doesn't know. But he can't move too much, with Techno and Wilbur clinging to him like a lifeline. He settles on just collapsing onto the ground, and keeping the knife raised. Bad watches with curious eyes, as Skeppy sends several glares towards Phil's direction, Phil sending them right back. The kids in his arms are barely visible underneath his black feathers, and when Phil notices where Bad's eyes are, he nearly snarls. There's so many questions Bad wants to ask, but it would be better if he could simmer down the situation first. "You can call me Bad," he says, getting to his feet and pushing Skeppy back, resting his hand onto his shoulder. "And this is Skeppy. You're in our home, in the forest that's under our watch. The village you came from isn't far." Phil's eyes narrow, his wings shifting as he glances down to his children. He murmurs a few words of reassurance at them, before turning his attention back to Bad. "And can I ask why we're here?" "This place is under our protection," Skeppy answers, crossing his arms over his chest. He doesn't sound anywhere near happy, but both him and Bad know this part of their duties, and they do take it seriously. "Anyone who needs refuge, they're granted it here. We found you and your kids in the forest after we chased the townspeople off. We brought you here, since you were bleeding out and you and your sons looked like you needed help." Bad continues, nodding a bit with his words. He glances down at Skeppy, who seems to be focused on the wings that Phil has. Bad watches with a tense patience as Phil seems to process their words. He seems skeptical for a moment, but then it melts into relief, his shoulders falling as he finally lowers the knife in his hands. "Oh." He looks at them again, seems to really look at them, noting their appearance, the way Skeppy stands a bit defensive. But Bad holds himself with an open air to him, a careful smile offered towards Phil's way. There's bandages wrapped around Phil's sides, and he can notice the pull of it against his skin, the way it's obviously meant to help with his wound he had gotten earlier tonight. Techno and Wilbur seem okay, and even more, they've changed clothes, having been provided with something clean. That sight alone, of them being taken care of while Phil was unconscious, chases away a bit of distrust in his heart. "All right, then." He lowers his head to Technoblade and Wilbur, his wings relaxing just a bit as he puts the knife down onto the ground and hugs them both tightly. "Are you both all right?" he whispers, holding his hands to the back of their heads, pressing his forehead to Wilbur's. "Are you hurt?" "No," Techno responds, tilting his head up as Phil goes to press his forehead against his. "Will's voice is overused, but we're okay other than that, I think." His voice wavers as he speaks to Phil, and Phil smiles. "Dad?" Wilbur whispers, Phil gently shushing him and telling him to rest his throat, before raising his attention back to their hosts. "It's all right, Will," he says quietly, then looks to Bad and Skeppy. "I'm Phil," he introduces, nodding his head to them both. "These are my sons, Technoblade and Wilbur." "Welcome to our home." Bad smiles. "Sorry for attacking you before." "Oh, no, it's fine." Bad waves his hands, laughing a bit. "You were worried. I'm sure if I had kids, I would panic waking up without them too. Skeppy narrows his eyes a bit, Bad nudging him in the arm. His face shifts into something more pleasant. Well, if introductions are out of the way, maybe you could talk to Bad for a bit while your kids can eat something? Techno turns his head behind him with a quiet glare, red eyes burning. Wilbur wraps his arms around Phil's neck, and even without trying to pull him off, Phil knows he's not going to let go. Would you mind bringing the food here? Phil asks. I'm sorry, but they're, overprotective. And with that, Phil has gone from kneeling on the floor with his kids in his arms to sitting up on the bed, Techno and Wilbur sitting right beside him, with matching bowls of soup in their little hands. Bad sits down on a chair across from them, hands clasped together on his lap. Skeppy stands behind him, almost like a silent protector, even though Bad hardly needs it. Me and Skeppy have lived in this forest for a long time. We've gotten our fair share of visitors here, usually people who are running from the town or from hunters. Bad explains, as Phil listens intently, keeping an eye on Techno and Wilbur as well, who eat like they're starving. Phil wipes a hand against Wilbur's cheek, trying to rub off the remains of food. You're not the first ones who have passed by, and you certainly won't be the last. I'm glad it seems like you're all okay, though. That last run-in with the hunters was a bit less manageable than I'd like to admit. Phil smiles. We've had plenty of experience with them, but I suppose tonight our luck was worse than usual. Phil tries to figure out if these two realize who they're sitting across from. So far, it doesn't seem like there's been a hint that they've heard of Techno and Wilbur, of what they're supposed to be. He assumes, maybe, that they don't care because they're hybrids as well. Or maybe they don't know. Phil's not sure if they would become hostile if they knew of the prophecy that's chained to these kids, and he doesn't want to risk anything. Seems like hunters have been on the rise lately. Bad murmurs, holding a hand to his face. I mean, it's been a little while since anyone has come by here, but hunters have been towing around the tree line a lot more often. As long as they stay away, Phil says, tilting his head down. I'm glad it's safe here, at least. We've been traveling for a while, and we were supposed to rest before continuing on our way, but, well. Then their room had gotten swarmed with hunters. Then they had to kill anyone who tried to kill them. Then it was a matter of just getting out alive, with the entire town trying to hurt them. I have a few questions, Skeppy says, raising a hand up. Bad gives a hesitant look behind him, not sure if now is the proper time for questions, seeing as Phil has only just woken up, and the kids beside him are finally more calm and content than since they first found them. Skeppy. Bad trails off, voice unsure. He's dying for answers too, so he's not putting up as much of an effort as he should be in stopping Skeppy from an impromptu interrogation. But he should be. You're an avian, Skeppy says. But he says it with finality, and the knowledge that avians aren't supposed to be alive. The tone in his voice gives that away, the way it's heavy with weight. But avians, all of them— Stop! Phil cuts him off, a slight panic in his voice. Wilbur pauses from eating, raising his head up to Phil. Technoblade's already finished his food, and he holds his bowl in his lap, looking at Bad and Skeppy, and watching their slightly surprised expressions, as Phil speaks with a barely noticeable waver in his voice. Bad's questions die off in his head as he looks at Phil's face and finds the slightest traces of fear hidden in there. He feels a quiet guilt run down his back. Phil holds his hands to Techno's and Wilbur's backs, giving a polite smile. I think I know what you want to ask, and I'd rather not speak about that in front of them. Techno looks towards Phil with a worried expression. Wilbur glances at Skeppy, face scrunching up as he tries to pick apart his intentions. Sorry, Skeppy mutters. Would you be willing to speak about it later? Bad asks, and Skeppy turns his head to him with a baffled face. Usually, he would think Bad wouldn't step on others' toes, wanting their guests to be comfortable. But instead, Bad is looking for any other chance to know what happened. Phil's face turns conflicted, and he looks at the bandages around his sides, and wraps his wings over Techno's and Wilbur's shoulders, sighing. Maybe. I would like to have a talk with you both, but these two, he pats both Techno and Wilbur on top of their hair, are my priority. I understand. Bad nods, and he gets up to his feet. I do mean it when I say you're welcome here. Me and Skeppy have been welcoming those who need our help for over a century. Wilbur's eyes go a little wide, surprised at hearing that. You must be old then, Techno says, and Wilbur snorts, slapping a hand to his mouth. Phil sighs fondly. Hey, Skeppy huffs, putting his hands onto his hips, while Bad just nods. Well, I'm sure I'm much older than you, that's for sure. Phil's old, Wilbur says quietly, Techno grinning. Phil just huffs, amused. Older than you know, Will. While things have simmered down, and Phil's made sure everything's safe, and this is actually a place they can breathe easy, it doesn't mean it's going to stay comfortable. The fact that they finally have a place to breathe easy is nice, but it's stifled with Phil's realization that these people also know of his past. First, that witch from earlier before asking, and now Phil sighs. And here he thought that his past could be left behind while he worked to get a new life with his children. He should have expected it, though. Something like that takes a long, long time to truly fade into nothing. And now that more and more attention shines on him, with his kids being chained to a bullshit prophecy, dead tales will start to be passed around. With Technoblade and Wilbur having eaten something, and the two of them content to have Phil awake, okay, and holding them both close for at least 10 minutes, it's not hard for Phil to coax them to try and get some rest. Bad has enough space for each of them to have a bed, but Phil insists they're all right with the room they have, and that one bed would be enough for all three of them. He knows that Wilbur and Techno wouldn't be able to sleep alone anyway. Bad changes the sheets on the bed, so they are no longer stained of Phil's blood from earlier, and he turns the lights down, letting it stay dim in the room, with only a single blue lantern sitting on the desk. It glows with a soothing blue, and Phil watches it with a smile, as Techno and Wilbur talk quietly to each other, sitting next to each other on the bed. Their feet have been cleaned from any dirt, and both their hair has been brushed back by Phil, who had been gifted a brush from Skeppy. They're both safe once more. And as Phil goes to sit down on the bed, they give him an expectant look. How about both of you try and get some sleep, okay? Phil asks, pulling at the blankets to let Techno and Wilbur crawl underneath them. Techno goes to tuck his legs underneath the blanket, glad with how soft it is. But Wilbur stays sitting where he is, frowning at Phil. Aren't you going to sleep? Wilbur asks, voice very low. He had gotten tea earlier, but Phil still insists he tries to hold off on speaking until his throat no longer stings. In a bit, mate. I want to go talk with those two who helped us. Then I'll come back and sleep. Phil's words are calm and sure, but his own heart beats a bit faster at the idea of having to talk to them. Techno frowns. Then we'll wait until you come back, then we can sleep. Phil huffs, getting up from the bed and leaning forward on one knee so he can press a kiss to Techno's head. No, I want you both to get some rest. Today was a lot, and I know you must be tired. He goes to give a kiss to Wilbur's forehead as well, Wilbur blinking for a moment, then smiling with warmth. But you're also tired, Techno gives as a response, pointing to Phil's chest, where bandages are still wrapped around his middle underneath his borrowed shirt. Bad had given him clothes to replace the torn ones he had before, but they do fit a bit loose on him, and Phil has to roll up the sleeves. I slept a bit earlier, Phil protests. That doesn't count, Wilbur says quietly, shaking his head. Phil just smiles. Well, I still would want you both to at least lay down if you're going to wait for me, okay? Go on, Will, under the blanket. Wilbur goes to climb in beside Techno, resting his head against the pillow, the two of them looking up at Phil. You better come back, Technoblade threatens, frowning just a bit. Wilbur hesitates, then sits back up. Can I come with you? Wilbur. I'll be really quiet while you talk. Phil shakes his head. No, you should sleep, mate. Both of you. I'm not sleeping until you get back, Techno declares, raising his chin as Wilbur flops back down onto the bed beside him. All right. But no sneaking out of bed, okay? Phil asks. And they both promise to stay, thankfully. Phil can't help the smile that creeps onto his face as he goes to walk out of the room. Even with the two of them determined to stay awake until Phil comes to sleep beside them, he had seen Techno yawn on the way out. He doubts they'll stay awake for more than 10 minutes. Skeppy and Bad are waiting for him in the kitchen, and Phil breathes in deep, then lets it out slowly, before walking down the dim hallway to go meet them there.